on today's testimony, I'm joined by MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Bloom, former Florida Circuit Court Judge Alex Ferrer, and Paul Henderson, a veteran prosecutor. Let's take a look at how Dr. DeMaio describes where the gun was in relation to Trayvon Martin's body.
It's my opinion that the muzzle of the gun in this case was 2 to 4 inches away from the skin. So the barrel of the gun was against the clothing. The muzzle of the gun was against the clothing, but the clothing itself had to be 2 to 4 inches away from the body at the time Mr. Martin was shot.
Now, according to DeMaio, that's consistent with Zimmerman's account that Martin was over him at the time of the shooting.
If you lean over somebody, you will notice that the clothing tends to fall away from the chest. If instead you're lying on your back and somebody shoots you, the clothing is going to be against your chest. So that the fact that we know the clothing was 2 to 4 inches away is consistent with somebody leaning over the person doing the shooting.
Lisa, I don't know how it played in the courtroom, but I can tell you that watching on television on MSNBC, I thought he was a pretty effective witness for the defense. What was your reading of the tea leaves?
On style, he's an A+. He speaks in plain English. He's very understandable. He's completely the opposite of Dr. Bao. But I have a lot more questions for him because I think what he established is that Trayvon Martin's clothing was 2 to 4 inches away from his body. He was not asked every possible explanation, like these are baggy sweatshirts. You know, when he demonstrates right there in his fitted shirt, the shirt doesn't really move forward when he goes forward, and it stays against him when he goes back. When you're wearing a baggy sweatshirt, 2 of them, it's a completely different situation. Trayvon Martin's shoulders could have been hunched forward. That could have explained it. He could have been down, and in the scuffle, the clothing bunched. I mean, really what he established was the clothing was, 2 inches is not very much, 2 to 4 inches away from Trayvon's body at the time that he was shot. That does not prove that Trayvon Martin was on top. It is consistent with that theory, but it does not prove it.
Judge Alex, you told us last night on Hardball that this was going to be an important witness for the defense. How do you think he played?
Well, I think he played amazingly. I mean, this is the kind of medical examiner testimony you want. The prosecution didn't get it, the defense did. I disagree. I think it does establish it. I mean, when you think about the other evidence, the grass stains in the wet back that George Zimmerman had, the grass stains on the knees of Trayvon Martin, John Good, who described that Zimmerman was on the bottom and Trayvon on top, and then you had this medical examiner that gives a scientific angle, on top of which we know that he had that bottle of the drink in his pocket, which would add weight to pull it over, to pull it down. In addition to that, he scored points on the key point, I thought, that was a question in everybody's mind. He pointed out that you probably would not have, or you don't necessarily have bruising on knuckles from hitting somebody, but especially when you've lost blood pressure. When he was shot in the heart, his blood pressure dropped, and he said basically that you need blood pressure for blood to get pumped to that area for bruises to start. And he said you never see bruising on people who've been killed.
In other words, people have been asking, and I think it's a great question, where is the bruising on Trayvon Martin's hands if, in fact, he was administering this MMA-style beating to George Zimmerman? Yeah. Dr. DeMaio said, essentially, in lay terms, well, the blood flow would have ended, and consequently, that would explain the lack of bruising. Paul, let me ask you this. Another important point for the defense that DeMaio made today was that it was possible to sustain head trauma without leaving a major visible mark. Take a look at this exchange between DeMaio and defense attorney Don West about the visible wounds on Zimmerman's head.
Yes. So the presence of the injury on the outside, are you saying doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't additional impact, or that the impact itself was minor?
Okay. What I'm saying is that you can get severe head trauma, but actually without any marks on the head. Or you can get marks, lacerations and contusions, and have head trauma. They're not necessarily... You know, more commonly when you get severe head trauma, you have some injury to the scalp. But you can get severe head trauma without a mark on the scalp, too.
To Paul Henderson, that head trauma, those wounds on the back of George Zimmerman's head, a very important aspect of this case. How do you interpret that testimony?
Look, it still didn't get me to interpreting that at the end of the day that he was facing a deadly injury. It still looks like de minimis injuries to me, and just scrapes and some little bruising there. I don't feel like the testimony, as good as it was, moved the jury beyond an explanation that put Zimmerman in fear of his life because of the injuries. I know that that was the purpose of trying to get him to address that, but it didn't feel like it to me that his explanation that that was possible is translating to that's what happened.
You are the prosecutor among us, the former prosecutor among us, so I want to ask you about this. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Bernie De La Rianda tried to play down the significance of what Dr. DeMaio had testified. Here it is.
You can't testify as to who threw the first punch.
That's correct, sir.
In fact, you can't really testify whether it was the first punch thrown.
That's correct, sir.
And you can't say whether it was Trayvon Martin defending himself or George Zimmerman defending himself in terms of when this first started.
When it first started, that's correct, sir.
So Paul Henderson, he could not establish, could not offer expert testimony as to whom the initiator was, but he did offer some pretty compelling testimony in terms of how the final act was committed. Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree, but I think, look, this was a good witness for the defense, and he was very credible and informative. It almost felt like a class in forensics when he was explaining his thoughts and his ideas about what he knew. And it was quiet in the courtroom. Everyone was paying attention. I felt like the prosecution did an outstanding job of standing up and getting that same witness to admit that he had no information and was not giving an opinion about the issues in contention and the different versions of the story that Zimmerman had as it related to the fight. He also got him to admit that he did not talk about and could not talk about who may have initiated the fight. And then finally, the third thing that they did that I thought was good with this witness from the prosecution's perspective was to get him to admit that he relied on his opinion based on their previous witnesses' report. And so I think that's what you have to do with an expert like this that comes across so credibly. You have to put him in a box and make sure that the jury understands that his credibility is only limited to a very small part of this picture.
Judge Alex, do you give the prosecution the high marks that Paul Henderson is for doing what they were able to do with Dr. DeMaio?
No, not even close. I mean, honestly, the prosecution stood up there and said, you can't say who threw the first punch. Sadly, that's not the defense's burden. That's a prosecution's burden, and they can't say who threw the first punch. The only evidence they have of who threw the first punch is George Zimmerman saying Trayvon threw the first punch. So the prosecution gets up after the doctor testifies about Trayvon's being on top is consistent, and the prosecution gets up and says, well, it would be consistent with Trayvon standing up and Zimmerman standing up and Zimmerman shooting him, and the doctor points out, no, that's not true. The clothes would be hanging down, and it would not be consistent. Immediately, the prosecution says, well, then it would be consistent with Trayvon backing away, like stopping the confrontation. And the message I think that sends to the jury is we, the prosecutors, are willing to throw out there any theory that may stick here, but that's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to have a theory, and they don't. And that is the big problem with this case. The defense has a theory that is being supported by forensic evidence, and the prosecution is in the role that the defense is usually in, trying to throw up stuff and make it stick.
Thank you, Lisa Bloom. Thank you, Alex Ferrer. Thank you, Paul Henderson, as well. Coming up, Republican opponents of abortion